Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the Monday, the week, the 13th of May, 2024, and we are back with you for an afternoon live stream where we're going to be talking about the question of the BRICS system and multipolarity. And there's been several interesting developments over the course of the past week that we need to catch up on, over the weekend in particular. And so we're going to be having a look at that and taking a look at what that means in terms of the topic at hand. First of all, just a shout out, as we say in the business, to those who are in the chat so far. We have somebody called Think Bricks who's left a comment saying interesting topic. Indeed it is. We have Jerry who joins us and says good afternoon, and I say good afternoon back. We have also Kobe who joins us and says hello, everyone. We have I Love HKTV says good evening from Tokyo, and I say good evening to you. Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, joins us, and as does Banana Bender from the other end of the world. Luca joins us, and we say good afternoon. And Kevin joins us from Sligo. We have Ben joining us, who says, hooray, an early start to a nice afternoon stream. Greetings from Paish, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Southwest Hungary. I'm pronounced Paish, CH like Chihuahua. Okay, well, hopefully I did a decent job pronouncing your home area there. Lino joins us from the reactionary. I'm sure you've spelt that the right way there, but I'm not going to quite say the word country of the Netherlands. Well, if we're on about reactionary countries, mate, then, well, you won't find anywhere ruled by a more despicable collection of reactionaries than here, other than perhaps the United States. My comrade Jason joins us on his train home from work. And be sure to check out Jason's latest article on the 60th anniversary, I believe it is, of the beaching cuts, and that was posted up. Link to that was posted in the Telegram group just the other day. The state of the British railways is a constant source of humour and frustration amongst the British working class. And we also have Agitate who joins us. Putin's Shirt is with us, as is Disco Void who joins us from Wythenshawe. Part of my origin story comes from Wythenshawe. Maybe I'll tell it someday. Marty joins us from the southwest of America. Ben says, good effort on the pronunciation. Well, Hungarian is not an easy language, mate. I've got to say that. Kobe joins us and says, India and the West are being a little more at odds with each other, especially with the assassinations. This may push India a little more towards BRICS, but they have their own self-interests. Yes, an interesting statement was made by Jai Shankar, the Indian foreign minister, just the other day, when he said that the US-led order is over, which is interesting because the Indian bourgeois have been playing a game of trying to balance between the Russians on the one hand, having somewhat fraught relations with the Chinese on the other, and trying to preserve a relationship with the US imperialists on the other. So that's free hands in this particular scenario. And the more that the defeat in Ukraine, the defeat of the collective West, the US imperialist bloc, I should say, in Ukraine becomes more and more clear, the Indians, of course, continue to lean more into the multipolarity idea. They'll probably try and retain their relations with the United States as long as they can. But the issue of this, the issue of the Sikh separatist movement and its usage by the United States and the Canadians to bash Modi over the head with, seems a bit of an attempt at sort of, shall we say, bringing the Indians back into line. And I really don't think it's going to work. I mean, there's a lot to say about Modi and the BJP, who indeed are reactionaries, particularly despicable variety in many respects, but they're not compradors, as it turns out. They don't represent a comprador bourgeoisie. There are comprador elements, I think, in the Indian bourgeois, but I don't think they're as strong as certain elements in Indian Marxism have said over the years. More on that when I've had a chance to read more about it, though. So yes, I think this ginning up and the usage of Sikh separatism by the Americans and the Canadians is going to backfire to them in quite a severe way in terms of the attitude of the Indian government to the US imperialists and the US imperialist attempts to recruit the Indians into whatever plan they've got to stage a provocation against the Chinese. Right. Lino says, I misspelled, but it turned out right. Yes, indeed. C. Bolt joins us. Good afternoon. Ben says, also, World Democracy Perception Index came out today. Russia and China up, US down, even in Western Europe, with some chilling headlines. Well, democracy here basically, I mean, it's a bourgeois democracy, so therefore, for them, it's working just fine. Well, not just fine, but like almost the way they would want it. For the rest of us, basically, like, as we've said many times here, the concessions made in the form of democratic rights to the working class after the later 19th century, all of these are being minimized or bureaucratized away in the West now. So participation of the masses in government is not something that any capitalist class wants at all. In fact, they are fanatically opposed to it. Kobe said, Modi and Erdogan are quite similar in terms of politics, being bourgeois nationalists. I'd say the same about Orban as well. Yes, that's true. I think the thing about, perhaps the thing all of them have in common is they are treacherous bastards in many respects, but all of them have we'll talk more about Orban in just a moment, but all of them, I think, have something in common, that they all have a political base which is actually rooted in the countries in question. Regardless of their reactionary politics, they owe their positions more to their own domestic political organizing than they do to international connections. So they're not simply placemen or stooges of imperialism, I don't think. Erdogan, there's a stronger argument to be made about him. He has certainly had his deals with the imperialists, which are very dubious, to say the least. Orban and Modi, more independent figures. We'll come on to more about that in just a moment. Carolus Maximus joins us. Good afternoon to you. Carmo joins us and says, good afternoon. Good to catch a live one. Good to have you with us. Zechariah 15 joins us on Twitter. Excellent. Ben says, Orban, 1989 to 2022. We're Europeans, we're Westerners. Orban, 2024, after Xi visit. We come from the East. Well, Viktor Orban has his principles, and if you don't like them, he has others. We have a comment from Irish Partisan who says the Russians appear to be making quick gains in their Kharkov offensive. Yes, I'll come to that in just a moment. Alan is with us from Oakland, California. Good morning to you, comrade. All right, so be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. We will proceed onwards with a couple of things. The two things I wanted to just lead on before we get to the discussion on the multipolar system. It's worth noting that just on the Russian government situation, that there is there has been a cabinet reshuffle going on over the course of the last couple of days. Mishustin got reappointed prime minister, unsurprisingly. He's credited with running an efficient government, and apparently Putin has a high opinion of him. The surprise move, such as it was, came in the form of Andrei Belousov, former deputy prime minister, who of the Russian Federation, who's credited with coming up with a lot of the industrial strategies that enabled the Russians to weather the storm over the last 10 years of the ever-increasing number of sanctions. And this, of course, was something that is taken seriously by Putin, and it's an interesting move that he's gone from being a very senior economic advisor to Putin, and also deputy prime minister, to being minister of defense, with Shoigu, who was, of course, locked in this feud with Prigozhin. Though it seems to be a very one-sided feud, as Shoigu never said anything about it. Prigozhin was, of course, a one-man, would probably start a feud in an empty phone box. But he has now been moved to be secretary of the National Security Council, which is the coordinating body which brings together all Russian military and intelligence aspects to coordinate a response to security and defense issues. Putin is the chair of that, and now Shoigu is the secretary of it. Formerly, it was Patrushev. So, quite what that means, it's more of a sideways move for Shoigu, though. Quite what the secretary of the National Security Council is an apparently prestigious position, but it seems to be mostly Medvedev who does a lot of the running of the actual business there. So it could be that it's Putin's way of giving Shoigu a, shall we say, a slow departure. So you make him the secretary of something. So it sounds like a big job. But in actual fact, he created the position, Putin did, of deputy chair of the Security Council. So Putin is the chair, Shoigu is the secretary, and Medvedev is the deputy chair of the Security Council. So essentially, if there is a deputy to Putin, because of course Yeltsin got rid of the vice president position of the Russian Federation back in '93 after the Black October events and the rebellion of the parliament there, who of course rallied around the vice president, as was back then Alexander Rutskoy. So there hasn't been a vice president since 1993. It seems that Medvedev is one in all but name, given that he's the deputy to Putin in the Security Council, and essentially goes and now plays the role of the professional troll online. So whether he'll ever be president of the Russian Federation again is an interesting question, given that he essentially spends all day, not a significant amount of his week, writing miniature essays for Telegram, in which he calls Biden a doddering fool who's beset with dementia, and saying that Macron is a feeble, effete homosexual, and various other insults, and that Olaf Scholz is a spotted liver sausage. So whether he'll ever get to be president again, having said all that, who knows? But then again, all the people that he's sticking the boot into are leaders of countries which are becoming increasingly, if not irrelevant, and rather unimportant to the foreign relations of the Russian Federation. However, that's by the by. So the move of Shoigu is an interesting one. I think my reflection is it's probably a way of giving him a dignified downgrade, given that Medvedev seems to run that committee when Putin's not in it. And Shoigu will basically just be responsible for setting up the meetings, I think. So it's a demotion without looking like a demotion, basically. It's a move into a job that is, if not a non-job, then a job that isn't as important as the title suggests. Now, there was, of course, the arrest of Timur Ivanov, one of Shoigu's deputy defense ministers, recently on corruption charges. Now, of course, if you did a thorough investigation into the British Ministry of Defence about corruption, then you'd probably have to arrest most of the senior officials, most of the senior military officers, and most of the politicians, given the fact that corruption in Britain is just part of how Britain does, the British ruling class does business. But it's interesting that a senior official did get arrested. There was a implication, it was implied recently that Putin would be doing a bit more cleaning house in the coming years, given that it's likely to be his last term. And so it's in that vein that we should view that's how we should view the appointment of Belousov as Minister of Defense. Now, the position of Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation has since the early 2000s been held by civilians. Prior to that, it was held by senior military officers. That is a tradition inherited from the Soviet Union and continued under Yeltsin. But most of the senior military officers in the early 90s got disgraced, those who were Minister of Defense, because of the appalling state of the Russian armed forces, their exposure in the Chechen war as being poorly led, poorly motivated, and with their equipment being either outdated or, again, poorly managed. Now, of course, you can if properly analyzed, you can understand why there was such a complete collapse in the morale of the Russian armed forces, because these had gone from inside a decade from being the armed forces of one of the two great powers of the world, which was, of course, the Soviet Union, to being the armed forces of a demoralized and corrupt state run by compradors who were seemingly out to destroy the Russian state itself, having already destroyed the Soviet Union and carried through a counter-revolution. And of course, whilst making relentless war on the working class, and therefore, why would working-class Russian conscripts want to go and fight and die for Boris Yeltsin? And also, you have had a gigantic amount of corruption in the officer corps, which, although it intensified under Yeltsin, it must be said that it had its roots back under Gorbachev and back as far as at least Brezhnev, given that the officer corps, or certain corrupt elements within it, started enriching themselves in the same way the party nomenklatura were in the mid to later period of the Soviet Union. So the appointment of civilians as Minister of Defense goes back to the early Putin years, who later brought in Serdyukov, who was this regarded as a sort of liberal aligned official who tried to push the Russian armed forces in the direction of more being organized, but more like the Americans. And this, of course, went down exceptionally badly. It must be said, though, that Serdyukov's reforms might not have worked. His cutting back of the officer corps, for instance, but the Russian armed forces were beset by other problems as well, which, though Serdyukov didn't do much to solve, he didn't create. There was a case of you had a bloated officer corps, you had a lot of desk soldiers cruising along and doing nothing. And so Serdyukov's departure did see an improvement, like some of the more extreme reforms he did to push the Russian military more in the US direction were done away with. The Shyu period, even though he's loathed by a lot of Russian nationalists and some Russian communists, though I can't see that he's worse than Serdyukov. In actual fact, the record of the Russian military during the time of Shoigu's appointment as Minister of Defense shows that he at least oversaw a period of stabilization, and also in terms of the achievements of the Russian military scientific and technical side of things, the breakthrough in missile technology, particularly the hypersonic missiles, that, of course, gave the Russian armed forces an edge over the US imperialists and the Europeans. Shoigu was also Minister of Defense when the successful operation in Syria was carried out. So I never quite understood the rabid hostility of the likes of Prigozhin to Shoigu. Now, of course, you could make some criticisms, as some do, that Shoigu was still protecting corrupt officials, and perhaps that's true. I don't know. The Ministry of Defense hierarchy was still too bureaucratic. The Russian army was still lacking, even to this day, in too many areas which are required for success in the special military operation. And there's still too many corrupt old guard officials in there. And I think that there's a lot of validity to that. But I would say overall that Shoigu's term there did represent at least a steady improvement in things. Now, to extend to Belousov is credited as being an avowed member of the Eurasianist group in the Russian government. If you read the Putin Paradox by Professor Richard Sakwa, who's something of a liberal academic, but a man who takes his subject seriously and whose research is very valuable, even if his political conclusions are, well, shall we say, disagreeable to those of our persuasion. But the information in those books that he writes on the Putin era is very good. The faction that Belousov belongs to are those who are very much enamored, shall we say, with the Chinese system, although I don't think that they truly understand what built it. These are people who favor a stronger role for the Russian state in the management of the economy. I would broadly define them as state capitalists, people who favor a strong state sector, essentially directing key areas of the economy. So people like Belousov, I think, favor the strengthening of like the state-owned enterprises like Rostec, for instance. But what he seems to be being brought in to do is to further strengthen the military state-owned enterprises and also tighten up and make sure innovation is pushed through in areas like drone technology, where initially the Russians were behind the NATO side. NATO side had invested quite a lot in drone technology, and of course they gave all of this to the Ukrainians. So apparently, according to some Russian commentators anyway, the Russian defense industry is still good at outproducing the West on hardware such as tanks, artillery pieces, and other requirements that the army has on those lines. But the high-tech production, they're still lagging in certain areas. And so Belousov seems to have been given a mandate to come in and sort that particular element out. So the old elements that have survived from the Soviet military industrial complex, such as places like the Ural Vagon Zavod tank production facility, missile production, artillery production, small arms production, all of that still seems to be quite efficient. And the other areas, though, are less so. So there's been a lot of criticism of the way that the Russian Navy is organized. There's been criticism of the way that, again, as I said before, Russia has appeared to lag behind on the latest high-tech stuff. So Belousov's job is to principally to sort out the running of the ministry itself, make that more efficient, and push forward in innovations around drones and robotics, integration of artificial intelligence, those kinds of things. And he belongs to that Eurasianist group who favor a state capitalist system. They are on good terms or relatively good terms with the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. The KPRF, with regard to Belousov, welcomed his appointment, though they were careful to say, well, if we stick with the what they call the market method, then Russia in the long term is doomed. But this appointment of Belousov is the right man for the job at this time, given the system that we've got. Basically, saying we're welcoming his appointment, but underlining the point that without full state planning, without the chasing out of the parasitic comprador elements who are still there inside the Putin system, albeit in under relative amounts of control and with much less power than they once had. So, yes, the Belousov appointment is an interesting one. The more I consider it, the more I look at the move of Shoigu is a downwards move in reality, though it doesn't appear to be so, given that the work of the Security Council is either done by Medvedev and it's sort of supervised by Putin himself. So quite what Shoigu is going to be doing there, I'm not sure. We'll see how this develops and how big his role is, or whether it's something that he does for a little while, then he retires when the special military operation comes to a close. Lavrov is, of course, retained as foreign minister. There was talk that he wanted to retire, but I think that what will happen is Putin will be still cautious in his appointments to key roles over the next few months whilst the war in Ukraine continues. Once the Russians have pushed on to victory, then we will see more changes coming, I think. So that's my overview of things when it comes to the changes at the Russian Ministry of Defense. Of course, Gerasimov remains the head of the Russian Armed Forces, head of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. And it is, of course, Gerasimov who will be making the decisions, is making the decisions with regard to the military operational side of the special military operation. Belousov's role is to basically run the civilian structure, the bureaucracy, to integrate the defense sector apparently into the wider economy, and to make sure that innovation is driven forward in these vitally important sectors in a way that perhaps it hasn't been done in the previous period. There are, of course, others who remain in and around the government who the KPRF denounce as 90s-style liberals, but it would seem that they are under these are relatively constrained now compared to what they would have been just a few years ago. So we'll have to see how this works out. Okay, pausing for more comments from the floor. Kobe says, Orban alludes to Tuvanism or whatever ethnic groups to whoever he visits and tries to woo them over. Many Hungarians believe that they're Central Europeans more than Eastern European anyway. Yeah, well, I think Orban just says whatever the situation requires. If he's being interviewed by an American who he favors, then he's always been a friend of the USA and always will be. It's just that the USA is letting him down. If he's with the Chinese, then, well, it turns out we Hungarians came from Central Asia or wherever. It's if you delve far enough back into the history of any group, you can find origins everywhere. Trust me, if we take over the running of Britain, need to do a deal with the Chinese, I'll be busy finding strands of British history that go back to Central Asia. If it'll sound good in a particular speech. Kobe says, many supposed Central Europeans are embarrassed to be Eastern European or Slavs, e.g. Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, etc. I have heard that before. It's easy for me to say being from Britain, but I would really think that people should get over this. Like this, I'm going to suppose, correct me if I'm wrong, that this sort of cringing and desperate desire to be from the West is something which is more from the petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie than it is the working class. But it's pathetic. It needs to be gotten over. Really does. It doesn't lead to anything. It's never led these countries to anything good. Look at the chaos in Armenia right now, because a bunch of bozos in the Armenian bourgeois and the foot soldiers of the U.S. imperialists and the petty bourgeois were desperate to prostrate themselves before U.S. imperialism. They're running the risk of destroying the whole country as a result. Battle Cossack says, my most anticipated upcoming TV program featuring Santiago Cuneo got censored and cancelled by orders of the president. So much for freedom of the press. So, yeah, this is Argentina, of course, where Battle Cossack joins us from. So is Milei now ordering the censoring of TV programs? Please specify and give us more information there if you can. Svetlana joins us from Moscow. Good to have you with us. Todd joins us and says, good morning from one of the richest states in the Union per capita that is number one in child hunger, number one in poverty, number 50 in education, and number one in violence, number one in illiteracy, New Mexico. Yeah. Is it like richest per capita, Todd? Because I'm going to guess there's some major corporations based in New Mexico. I'm not familiar with the economic makeup of New Mexico. So is it the case then that there's some major corporations that are based there, but the benefits of that just, of course, do not go to the proletariat at all, and so you end up with a gigantic amount of poverty in these tiny islands of wealth, because that's fairly common across the so-called West now. Kobe says Russian military is going to be integrated to the overall Russian economy to meet certain demands. That's interesting. I'm going to be very curious to see how this works out, given that the criticism that the Gorbachevists and the Yeltsinists always made was that the military in the old Soviet Union was draining resources away from the real economy. There's an argument to say that there's some elements of validity to that, but I think that it's massively overstated. Be interesting to see what way that the military is going to be further integrated now, what that means. But I think that what it means in terms of Belousov and what he wants to do is that they're going to be strengthening the state-owned enterprises, particularly those which are under the direct control of the Ministry of Defense, or are under the guiding hand of the Ministry of Defense. So strengthening the state-owned enterprises that are responsible for defense, I think, and probably diversifying them more into, like, first of all, military high-tech production involving robotics, drone tech, integration of artificial intelligence, those kind of things, and also developing dual-use technologies via the state-owned enterprises. So, like, robotics has, of course, dual usage. Drone technology has civilian usage, potential civilian usage as well, quite considerable civilian usage. AI integration into various different systems, also very extensive civilian usage. So the what is produced by the state-owned enterprises or spurred on by the special military operation can have, of course, extensive civilian dual use. And if the state-owned enterprises become centers of innovation, then that can be economically beneficial. Perhaps this is part of what the Belousov plan will be. Irish Partisan says Belousov's appointment means that Russia is going all in, and two, it's a pivot to the Eurasianists. I think that's undeniable. I think the pro-American bits of the Russian ruling class have been very much weakened and diminished over recent years. The pro-European part, which probably included Putin himself, I think there's a strong desire on Putin's part to integrate Russia into Europe. I think it's taken a long time for him to have that literally kicked out of him by the Europeans themselves. But they'd have to be blind and stupid to see that, to still believe that that the integration of Russia was ever going to be possible inside the EU. They didn't want the integration of a Russia that was anything other than a state run by compradors, and took Putin a while to fully work that out. But now he apparently has learned the lesson, as have the rest of the Russian ruling circles. I think what is it? The name that they use for Putin's circle, is it the Siloviki? Correct me if I'm wrong about that. Irish Partisan says China is sponsoring the admission of Cuba, Serbia, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Venezuela into BRICS. Well, then China will probably get it. I think we'll go on to discuss BRICS in just a moment, but it's a very welcome development, particularly for Cuba, which needs that trade and investment desperately. Serbia, which requires partnerships being built. I mean, I hope that the admission of Serbia into BRICS can follow, and that the ever-growing importance of the partnership with China can spare the Serbs the humiliation of having to being forced into the EU. Now, of course, if Serbia was to be run by a socialist government, then it wouldn't be forced into the EU, but it's run by a perpetually vacillating bourgeois government now headed by Vučić. But hopefully the disintegration of the EU will come soon, and the disintegration of NATO shortly afterwards, or maybe even before it. And so it'll spare the Serbs the indignity of having to apply to join either of these organizations, because they shouldn't. Nobody should, to truth be told. All of those Balkan countries, former Yugoslav countries that joined NATO and the EU, are going to be left high and dry pretty soon. And they're all, the working classes of those countries are going to wander. Many will wander already, to be truth be told. Just what the hell the point was of destroying the country, breaking them all up and having them join these blocks, which within 30 years are all collapsing. So very welcome development if this goes through. Irish Partisan asks, what are your thoughts on what is happening in Georgia right now? Will the pro-West opposition prevail? And if they do, what happens? It's an interesting one. It points to two things. One, that the ruling class in Georgia appear to be divided. The Georgian Dream party that's in power right now is a party which is run by a faction of the Georgian Bourgeois. And they've been in power for quite a while now. And they are clearly the faction of the bourgeois that is, well, not completely stupid. They realize that the geographical location of Georgia, its proximity to Russia, the growing importance of the trade with China, all point towards an Eastern orientation. However, Georgia has the same problem that Armenia has, and that is that for 30 years, ever since the collapse of the USSR, the rulers of Georgia, up to this day, have been, up to now, have been compelled, either willingly or otherwise, to accept the unrestricted activities of the US imperialists and the Europeans in Georgia, running propaganda organizations through the media, through academia, running cultural influencing operations. And if you look at the things that are said by the so-called opposition, I mean, it's ludicrous stuff. I mean, the idea that they're going to be offered this amazing European future. I mean, I've run into that. We've discussed this many times on this channel, the delusions that particularly, like, I find that the petty bourgeois have in places like Georgia, like generally people who come from either sort of upper working class or solid petty bourgeois background, who are stuck between, of course, the bourgeoisie in these countries and the working class, who can't, who feel that their incomes are restricted, or feel that, or know that the only way towards a big income for them is to take a job at one of these NGO operations, and so as a consequence of which become an active agent of imperialism. Now, this could be more easily defeated if the Georgian government was in any way, well, more rooted in the Georgian masses. As far as I can see, it has some popular support. I mean, it won the elections, but it can turn out a certain number of people, but it's the government seems to be hoping that the protests will just burn themselves out. That's what seems to be going on. It's a dangerous game to play, because we've seen that the imperialists and their local stooges are willing to use all manner of extremely violent methods to get their way. And what's being forced upon the Georgians now is a choice that they would have to make. They have to make. And it's not the Russians or indeed the Chinese that are compelling them to make this choice. It's the imperialists, who are basically saying to them, you have to let us essentially run your country. That's the demand that they're making. Forget all this guff about freedom, democracy, etc. We know by now that this doesn't mean anything. What the bourgeoisie of Georgia are being asked to do is to essentially, you must turn over the running of the entire country, just in the same way they demanded that Shevardnadze do this 30 years ago, 25 years ago to 30 years ago. You must turn the running of the country over to us. If you try and resist, if you try and exert even the smallest amount of resistance to this, then not only will we continue to destabilize your country, we will actively work to destroy it. That's what they're saying. If you try and do this double-facing approach, which the Georgian bourgeois want to do, which Yanukovych's group in Ukraine, Party of the Regions, that was what they wanted to do. They wanted to face both ways. For a while, there's an argument to say that Lukashenko in Belarus wanted to, but he was smart enough and much more rooted within the Belarusian masses than the Ukrainian group were, or the Georgians are, to be able to face down the color revolution when it did come. My worry about Georgia is that the Georgian Dream Group aren't anything like strong enough to resist this pressure, because the only way they can get around this essentially is to turn around and tell the US and the Europeans to go fuck off, because they're not going to stop putting the pressure on them. The prize for them is a big one, which is not that they're going to in any way assist the Georgian people. They're not. Their only aim would be to turn Georgia into another front against the Russians, reignite the wars in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, for instance, tie up Russian forces there. And if Georgia gets completely destroyed in the process, well, the US imperialists will say, look, see, those terrible Russians, they've done it again. On to the next place. And this is why we should hope that the Georgian bourgeois have something about them, have enough about them to realize that now is the time when they will need to jump and make a choice. And that's a difficult one to make, given the historically bad relations that they've had. The historically bad relations that have been created by various Georgian nationalists over the years with Russia. But in actual fact, the Georgian government now seems to realize that the future does lie in further trade with Russia, building the economic relationship with the Chinese. That's what the future is. There's no future in whatever the hell it is that the West has in mind for them, because they must know by now that the only thing the West really has in mind for them is to use them as a battering ram against the Russians. Same for the Armenians. Use them to destabilize Russia in however you can. And if the country gets wrecked, oh, well, what a shame, never mind. So I hope that the Georgians prevail and that they prevail over these assholes. But it's going to take a struggle. And it will depend upon whether the Georgian bourgeoisie is in any way capable of leading that struggle. If they're not, then they'll have real problems, because from what I can tell, again, correct me if I'm wrong, communists in Georgia don't have a strong position. Georgian nationalism is a very shaky, almost perpetually reactionary force that has always sided with the imperialists at various different times over the last 100 years or so. And so I wouldn't have much faith on that. But given that the Ukraine war is in its final straits now, and given that everybody can see how badly it is going, perhaps that will help the opposition to the NGO group in Georgia and to Pashinyan in Armenia to strengthen themselves and ultimately prevail. I hope that both prevail. I've never been to either country, but you look at the pictures of old Soviet Georgia and Soviet Armenia, and there's a lot of great beauty there. You look at the mountains and the hills of both places now, and you see a incredibly beautiful places that should be places which are fine to live in for the proletariat and the peasants there, but have been wrecked by decades of rule by the degenerate bourgeois elements. So of course, we must say that only a return to socialism will really save either country. But in the immediate period, we can at least hope that the open comprador elements get defeated, and a struggle to reassert sovereignty and independence against imperialism will lead to a more positive development and perhaps a regeneration of socialist struggle in these countries. Todd replies to us about New Mexico. vast physical wealth in natural resources, oil, gas, uranium, zinc, molybdenum, I don't know what that is. I'm presuming it's a rare earth metal. Correct me if I'm wrong. And the third largest wealth fund in the United States, 33rd largest in the world. The extracted wealth leaves the fund. I think you've carried on another message there. Our industry is the nuclear weapons lab, Los Alamos and Sandia. So essentially, it's a wealth extraction site for the US bourgeois who extract the wealth and leave with it. It's sounds like a fairly similar story to, well, many other places in the world, but it's an interesting development in the heart of imperialism itself, that the bourgeoisie becomes more and more located, of course, in one particular area. That their business operations go all over the United States, but the wealth is drained out of the particular states. It's interesting. One particular area of research which I would like to do more on in the near future is the structure of US capitalism inside the United States itself. So Americans will, of course, know far more about this than I do, but I'm interested to know if there is, like, how much of a regional bourgeoisie is there? So how much of a bourgeoisie that's based purely in the states itself? So is there, for instance, a New Mexico bourgeois? I'm fairly certain there's a Texas bourgeois with interests that go around the state, but not really that far outside of the state, or maybe they have interests in a few neighboring states. Of course, they'll all be linked to Wall Street, etc. But it'll be interesting to see how much of a regional bourgeois there is in the United States now, or how much of it has just been monopolized away. Svetlana says there is a growing slogan here in Russia that says to be anti-Soviet is to be anti-Russian. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Well, I've been told by various different sources that the opinions towards the USSR and the Russian working class, I don't think ever varied too much. It was always a very high degree of popularity, of course, a very low degree of popularity of what was done in the 1990s. But I think as time goes on, the absolutely reactionary, horrific nature of the dissolution of the Soviet Union becomes more and more obvious. And I mean, Svetlana, you can correct me, obviously, on this if I'm wrong. I think a lot of Russians probably do see that their survival in the face of the sanctions regime and the relentless hostility of the imperialists, a lot of it does depend upon the industrial legacy of the Soviet Union. Plus, Russia, half of the stuff that Putin says has its roots in the Soviet Union, like his nationality policy, which, he's always diminishing the role of Lenin. But when he talks about, as I've said before, what being Russian is, he basically says Russia is this multinational, multi-confessional state, which contains many ethnicities and cultures, and we respect them all, and they are all Russian. That's very, very close to the Soviet nationality policy as outlined by Stalin. It's different to what you hear from the what I would call the Russian chauvinists and the Russian nationalists, who are the what I would call the Russian equivalents of Bandera, who are, and I think most of them have actually fled a lot of them anyway, have fled to Ukraine to join with the fascist forces there. But there was a strong trend, I think, in the 90s in Russia of that Russian just meant European Russia. And I think if that view had ever prevailed inside the Russian government, that would be an absolute disaster. So it's a welcome trend that the Soviet era is not only being looked back upon with nostalgia, but also being assessed in terms of the living history, meaning that if more people in Russia are coming to understand that what they were told about the Soviet Union by their own leaders, including Putin and including Medvedev in their earlier incarnations, was wrong and was propaganda that was actually inspired by comprador elements and by the US imperialists themselves, and that's a positive thing. What needs to happen, though, and this is, of course, not just the case in Russia, it's even more the case here, is that we communists need to everywhere get our act together so that when now we're in a period of great change, we are looking at huge opportunities as people turn against, in a more and more decisive fashion, the capitalist order, and communists need to be in a position to be able to direct that rejection in the right direction. Marty says, New York is the richest per capita. New Mexico has the highest sovereign wealth fund. Probably not very sovereign. Svetlana confirms the Siloviki, other state security forces, including police and FSB. China helped revive Serbia's steel industry, lost over the Yugoslav period. Interesting. Stalin was Georgian, Gracinol. Indeed, he was. Georgia's most famous son. I think remembered well, probably by a lot of Georgians, but the comprador elements on both sides of this current debate don't want to acknowledge him, of course. You think the West will try to start another conflict in the Balkans if Serbia aligns too much with BRICS? Oh, yeah. I mean, undoubtedly, they'd try to do something. They'll try. I mean, Kosovo is the obvious pressure point. They'll try and do something there. If they think that the Serbs, Alexander Mercouris did make a good point in his program on the Duran when they were discussing the visit of President Xi to Serbia and Hungary, that if the Russians take control of all of Ukraine, or any new version of the Ukrainian state which is aligned with Russia comes out of this, essentially now, if you look at Serbia, it's now got a potential land bridge all the way into Russia and ultimately into China. The US imperialists won't want that. So quickest way to start trouble in the Balkans is basically get the puppets in Kosovo to do something. Get them to stage a provocation. Try and provoke a war. Or, I think the idea wouldn't be to provoke a war as such, so it may end up with that. It's to use Kosovo to pressure Vucic. If the Serbs align too much with BRICS, or to go look like they're going to join BRICS, then the British and the Americans will tell Albin Kurti in Kosovo, well, you better kick off, declare independence, enact some new harsh measure against the remaining Serb population, something like that, something which starts a destabilization process that would force the Serb government to take action and force them to potentially enter into some kind of military confrontation that would, of course, involve NATO. And, of course, what the slimy bastards who run the EU and NATO will say is, well, you know, a lot of people are concerned about your alignment with BRICS, Alexander. So if you really want to commit to your European future, how about calming down all this talk of joining BRICS and potentially building further ties with the Chinese and the Russians? You know, remember, you've got to be committed to the European Union. And if Vucic may then make some noises about distancing himself from BRICS, the tensions in Kosovo will magically go down again. That is the way it will go. Of course, this is a cynical game, but it also reckons without the influence of the masses across the old Yugoslavia. There's a lot of these countries are mired in poverty. A lot of them are desperate. I remember 10 years ago when big demonstrations broke out in Bosnia, people were running around carrying, these were Bosnians of various different faiths and nationalities, were waving pictures of Tito. And these were guys who were like my age and a bit younger, who'd grown up since the war and had no real memory of it, but they were waving pictures of Tito. Why? Well, the Tito period meant guaranteed employment up until like the 80s. It meant stable communities. It meant decent education. It meant a more stable existence than they are offered now, a more hopeful existence than they are offered now, for all its flaws. And there's many flaws in the old Titoite system. But what I would say is that the failure of the imperialists, one of their biggest failures, is they always think of themselves as being completely in control of the situation when they're not. They're not. They are not reckoning with the potential power of the masses in the Balkan region. And if things go kick off in a serious way there in places like Bosnia, then they're not going to be able to manipulate the situation in Kosovo too much. Things may escape their control quite quickly because there's a lot of frustration and anger across all of the Balkan countries, which I don't think the imperialists have taken particularly seriously. I think they've got the situation under control. Svetlana says, Siloviki literally means the men of strength or men of power. Interesting. Martin says, greetings to you all. Just watched the Russia Today segment about the countless Red Army memorials which are being destroyed by many European countries in order to please their US masters. Shameful. Indeed it is. But then again, how was it ever going to go any other way? When socialism was destroyed, when the Soviet Union was destroyed by compradors, the fascists were the ones who were going to be the biggest beneficiaries of that. And now the fascist history, or shall we say, distortions of history regarding World War II will become commonplace. Like you get Corinne Pierre, who always tells us how diverse she is, backing the fascist narrative about Ukraine actually fought Hitler and Stalin in World War II with the glorious USA. That's something that 10 years ago, only like Baltic reactionaries would come out with and Ukrainian fascists. Now you have the White House press secretary saying it. So this is the way that historical distortion was enabled by the destruction of socialism, which, of course, many of the Soviet hierarchy in the later period played their part in. But this is what happens. You give them, you surrender like Gorbachev did, you're surrendering to imperialism and fascism, which is what's happened. And the Russian ruling group have finally woken up to that. Hopefully not too late. Slava joins us and says, I think they're going to try and mess with Lukashenko soon too. That wouldn't be a surprise. I don't think they can run Tikhonovskaya again, but they'll try to. They'll try to do something. Our comrade Irish Partisan will know much better than this, but much better than I do. But it seems to me that the Belarusian state, for all that it has problems, is quite strong, and the masses in Belarus, for all that they might have problems with the Lukashenko government, they won't want. The overwhelming majority of them, I don't think, will want anything to do with a Western-backed candidate. So we'll see what plans, this diabolical plans, the West has in mind for Belarus. I'm sure they've got something, but I'm sure that the Belarusians can resist it. Total Revolution says, I'm glad Suleiman the Magnificent became the Marxist-Leninist. Well, I'm not sure what that was referring to, but good to have you with us. Kobe says, funny how nationalists always do the bidding of the elites of foreign countries anyway. We only know it's up to the communists to fix the mess and save the nation. Yes, only communism can save any nation, as we all know by now. Right. Svetlana says, there are two words in Russian for Russian that are translated simply as Russian. One is Ruski, ethnic Russian. One is Rossiyanin, citizen of the Russian Federation. Putin would have used the latter. I guess it's something like the difference between English and British. Yeah, possibly. Interesting. We'll have to come back to the Russian national question. It's an interesting one to explore further. Irish Partisan says, topic Kosovo government has brought in a law banning the use of the Serbian dinar and the use of Serbian car registration plates in violation of the 2013 Brussels Agreement. Yeah, that'll be something that the Kosovans bring that up, probably on the orders of the British or the Americans whenever they want to put pressure on Vucic. They'll probably try something else pretty soon following Xi's visit. Total Revolution says, in Balkans, in particular Croatia and Serbia, a process of rehabilitating former fascists collaborators is ongoing, namely Ustasha and Chetniks. Yeah, I've seen both of those. I mean, make no mistake, the government of Serbia is run by bourgeois opportunists who, again, are pretty weak in many respects. I don't think that they offer much of a future for the Serbian masses. Again, the only way to the only way back for all of these countries is to re-find and begin again the struggle for a socialist Balkan federation that should never have been allowed to break up in the first place. I don't think the majority of the Balkan working class, the Yugoslav working class, wanted that. And unfortunately, though, the revisionists had weakened the government to the point where it couldn't stop the unraveling of the state. What are your thoughts on Belousov being appointed defense minister, asks Oz. Well, go back to the beginning of the video and I explain it there. Okay, just on the question of Hungary and Serbia, clearly the important that the visit of Xi Jinping be acknowledged there, and the interesting thing from his visit to Hungary was he signed 18 different agreements on economic and cultural and scientific cooperation, which is a hefty total. And of course, Orban was very effusive in praising the relationship with the Chinese, and the announcement that they made at the end of Xi's visit about the joint statement between the People's Republic of China and Hungary on the establishment of an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership for the new era. So it's clear that the Chinese are serious, serious about this partnership and wanting to build it much further. Also, it must be said, I'll come to Orban now. I mean, Orban, a reactionary, clearly, but not one who is a simple puppet of imperialism, it must be said. I mean, if you examine Orban's political history, of course, he started off in the youth wing of the old ruling party in the People's Democracy period, before, of course, becoming an agent of US imperialism, which he was, and was trained, I believe, at least in part, in Britain. Returns there and then leads a reactionary party, but after he loses the elections at the end of the 2000s, he is forced to go away and actually build up a political base that's more rooted in the grassroots in Hungary. And so the reason why he survived attempts to remove him via the electoral process was because he has built a solid political base there now. And so he can take a certain amount of risks. He's also an astute man, even if he is a reactionary. He's not blindly loyal to US imperialism. He understands quite clearly that it's on the downslope. He understands that the proximity of Hungary to Russia makes the relationship there an important one to preserve. And he's smart enough to not get involved in any of these silly ideas regarding sending troops to Ukraine. And he can see the way that the world is turning, which is why he was talking about multipolarity so much with President Xi the other day. And so this joint partnership is going to be interesting in terms of its development. There's already a lot of business being done between Hungary and China. And of course, Orban was keen to underline the point that he supported the one China policy, that there was no question of backing an independent Taiwan, which again will piss off the US imperialists royally. So again, he's an example of a reactionary who is more perceptive than most, in that he sees where the future's going. It should be stated, and of course, maybe Ben can correct me if I'm wrong about this, Hungarian capitalism is a fairly weak creation anyway. I mean, for all Orban's efforts to revive it, Hungarian capitalism needs investment, and it's not really going to come from the United States or even the EU now, given that both of those, but the EU is in crisis and there won't be a lot of investment coming from there. So really, Hungarian capitalism, if it has any chance of survival, the only chance it's got of external investment comes really from the East, partially from the Russians, but especially from the Chinese. So Orban really has no choice now, and whoever his successor will be has no choice but to continue building positive relations with China, especially if the EU comes to the point of collapse, which my personal prediction is that it will collapse probably within the next 5 to 10 years. Maybe we'll cut it in the middle and say 7.5. But within the next decade, the EU will be no more. Maybe something will survive in Northern Europe, but not in Southern Europe. Right, let's have a look back here. Kobe says worker self-management in Yugoslavia led to high levels of unemployment, 20%, and ethnic groups partaking in nepotism. Yeah, like I said, a lot of problems with that system. Still better than what they've got now, which is why Tito is still admired in many areas. Irish Partisan says, word on the street here in Minsk, Lukashenko will step down after the next presidential elections to be held next year. Natalia Konchanova, of the Speaker of the Council of the Republic, is favorite. So he's, just to clarify, Irish Partisan, so the word in Minsk is that Lukashenko will stand again, but even if he wins, he'll basically sit down and there'll be a transition to Konchanova. I'll have to check out who she is. Is she part of Lukashenko? I'm taking it she's part of Lukashenko's political organization. Kobe says Orban went from being an anti-communist liberal when he was a stooge of George Soros to an anti-communist bourgeois nationalist. Not much of a difference anyway, still an anti-communist. However, Orban harps on about illiberal democracy. Well, that's a meaningless term, by the way. But communism is a preferred lol. Homeless Hungarians get kicked out from cities and homeless Hungarians sleep in the woods. Yeah. Hungarian capitalism hasn't got a lot to offer. It's a very weak creation. Then again, you're talking about the treatment of homeless Hungarians. Homeless British people don't get much treated much better. All of the West is on the slide, and its barbarity increases bit by bit as we go along. Irish Partisan says the presence of the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, at the Victory Day parade in Moscow was not lost on many observers of the closer relationship between Moscow and Havana, not seen since the USSR. Yeah, I mean, very important relationship in the past. I think that the Russians are placing much more value on it these days, as are the Chinese, it would seem. As I remember seeing some quite interesting footage of Xi Jinping and the rest of the Chinese Politburo in the Cuban embassy in Beijing, delivering a commemorative floral wreaths to the embassy on, I think it was the anniversary of the death of Fidel Castro. And they all these guys file into the Cuban embassy and they all place their floral tributes at the foot of this bust of Fidel, and they all bow in respect, which I think is interesting. It's not the kind of thing you would expect. Not the kind of thing you would expect a government to do if they weren't serious about maintaining very, very close relations. And certainly, I think that the Chinese leadership at the moment, given the relentless hostility of the US imperialists, has less and less of a reason to spare the feelings of the imperialists, or to try and maintain good relations by not appearing to be active in what the imperialists regard as their backyard. Well, the Chinese have no reason not to build greater and greater relations with the Cubans now. And if they're going to be putting forward Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, and to the BRICS, for membership of the BRICS, along with Serbia, then basically it's clear that the Chinese have decided that the US is on the way down, and the US is not going to stop fucking around in the South China Sea. So why bother why bother making concessions over relations with countries in the Americas when essentially they're trying to weaponize the Philippines under Marcos Jr. and Taiwan and Japan and Australia against China? Why bother? Why bother treading lightly around them when they're not treading lightly around you, and you have no reason to be afraid of them anymore? Grassy Knoll says, I read somewhere that Macron wanted to join BRICS but was rejected. He wanted to attend the BRICS summit in South Africa. But they basically said, no thanks. No merci, Emmanuel. And why would they want him there? What has he got to offer? Nothing. I mean, you see Xi Jinping's face when he had to endure the presence of Macron and von der Leyen. Can you imagine having to have a conversation with these vacuous idiots? I mean, I remember reading in and talking vacuous idiots, one of Obama's execrable autobiographies, because he's written at least two, isn't he? I think he's written four now, two prior to him becoming president and two afterwards. I mean, the ego on the man is incredible. But he says in there that he, when they were in I think it was a G20 summit, he hunted down, I think it was Hu Jintao and Lula, who were having a private discussion. And like the way he writes it, and I'm sure this is Obama bigging himself up, he sort of barreled in to this discussion and says, hey guys, let's talk about climate change. And like, you can just imagine like the Chinese and the Brazilian leaders having to deal with this smug, self-righteous, empty-headed shithead who wants to talk to you about something on a paper that was written for him as propaganda, which he's going to deliver to you as if it's scientific fact. Jesus. To be the president of any nation, particularly the president of China, you probably have to have an incredibly thick skin and the ability to endure people like von der Leyen and Macron, or even Rishi Sunak, even worse, or have a conversation with Joe Biden and pretend that he's not just repeated the same sentence 15 times. Martin asks, what is your opinion on Slovak President Fico? He's also against the Ukraine war. There are more and more parties winning in the East who are against this insane war. Macedonia also elected an anti-NATO party. It's an interesting development. I mean, Fico was in the old Czechoslovakian Communist Party back in the day, as was, by the way, the Czech president, Pavel. But Fico is interesting. He's a sort of Slovak social democrat. He's interested in building up the Slovakian economy, and he's a smart enough political operator to realize that there's no building up of the Slovakian economy anymore, just the EU. I mean, there's a realization has dawned throughout a lot of certainly amongst the working class of these countries, I think even amongst the petty bourgeois now, that EU membership was not a road to riches for them. That in actual fact, it was the opposite. And it's only leading to more and more instability and chaos. So it'll be interesting to see if Fico is able to keep his government alive. I'm sure the Germans and the French will be out to undermine him, as will the United States. But we'll see how it goes. I mean, so it's a welcome development that he's there and can voice opposition to the war in Ukraine. How much power he can wield, I'm not sure, though. Jenny, hello to you. Good morning. Ben says, everything Alex is saying now is verifiably true, re Orban. As for the capitalist system, it was designed and made to serve Germany, which is sinking. Yeah, the whole EU structure was designed to serve the German bourgeois. If the German bourgeois sink, the entire EU structure sinks. The French bourgeois can't save it. The Italians are too weak. Forget Spain and Portugal. It's very much a German operation. And again, if Germany goes, the EU goes. Wayne says, Putin does love Fidel Castro. Pretty sure he put up a statue to Fidel in Russia. He put up a statue of Fidel in Moscow. And Diaz-Canel was there when it was unveiled. Last year, I think. So yes, Putin, I think one of his first meetings was with Castro. I think you see him talk about Castro. It's clear that Putin does admire Castro. In the same way, when he talked to Traore of Burkina Faso, it's clear that Putin has an admiration for Thomas Sankara as well. And also he had very good relations with Chavez. So I think this is reflective of a couple of things. Like Putin does, on a political level, have a liking for these tough, fighters for independence of their countries, for sovereignty of their countries. I think that's probably how he likes to see himself. I mean, we all have ways we like to see ourselves. I'm sure plenty of Russians, probably plenty of Russians in the Russian left, would disagree with that that view that Putin perhaps has of himself. But I think he undoubtedly, I mean, we've said this many times before, we have had we have the case with the evidence now to support the case that Putin, whatever you might think of him, has been overall a progressive option. He has pursued a progressive path towards greater sovereignty and independence for Russia, and that his time in office will be seen as stopping the rot that Yeltsin, well, to be fair, Gorbachev, then Yeltsin put in place of just trying to make first the Soviet Union and then Russia into an appendage of the West. And Putin stopped that. Whatever else his legacy turns out to be, that he'll be remembered for that, which is more positive than many of his predecessors. Apparently, the potential successor of Lukashenko is a member of the Belaya Rus party, which is Lukashenko's party. Abtin joined us. Good to have you with us. Ian Foster, good afternoon to you, comrade. Kobe says, sort of good for China to focus more on the socialist world, but hoping this kind of extend towards exporting revolutions like before. Well, we'll have to see. I think that the Chinese attitude will remain that they don't interfere. But then again, it's not just down to them. The presence of China in the world and their willingness to back projects like Nicaragua, like Bolivia, like Cuba, like Venezuela, which are very important in terms of the fate of Central and Southern America, and possibly Northern America as well. All of this is going to be tremendously important for the building of socialism in those countries. But in terms of us and our fate in the West, I mean, the revolution here is down to us. The presence of China in the world, and you've heard my opinions about the Chinese revisionists before now, but it's undoubtedly the case, much like the Soviet Union before them, the Chinese in the world aids us in the West in our building for revolution. First of all, it is, regardless of the fact that it's on the capitalist road to a large extent, does represent an alternative model for many countries which have been subjected to the exploitation of imperialism, colonialism to follow. And if they're able to follow that and do their deals with the Chinese and break the exploitative relations with the West, then that can only help us, because it stopped our ruling class from hyper-exploiting countries like Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and other places. So the presence of China is helping revolutionaries in the West, whether they form the new Comintern or not. So it's down to us as to build our organizations, to build communist parties in the imperialist countries, and to maximize the advantages given to us by the presence of China in the world and the weakening of the imperialists. So they're helping us by continuing on continuing to exist as an alternative pole in the world. But the fate of the revolutions in, well, not just the West, but every country, is down to the activities of the proletariat here and the strength of the communist parties here. Again, China's existence helps us, just as it was foolish for anybody to ever say that the Soviet Union was anything other than an aid for the development of a socialist revolution. Its presence there, even in the later revisionist period, aided the struggle for socialism, whether the leadership wanted to or not. And its disappearance set the struggle for socialism worldwide back for a generation. We're only just starting to come out of this now. And so when I see these fools still going on about the need for an anti-bureaucratic revolution in China, it's like what you're calling for is a Chinese Gorbachev. And what would happen is another setback in the fight for socialism for another generation, if the Chinese government were to fall or implode as the Soviet one did. It's not going to, by the way. It's immeasurably stronger and better run than the Soviet version it was. And the Chinese leadership, the current Chinese leadership, whatever you might think of them in terms of the political line they're on, have clearly learned a number of very important lessons from the collapse of the USSR. As Jenny says, going back to the Obama comment, sorry, Obama, you're just not that interesting. He's not. He's a vacuous idiot. Can you imagine trying to talk to him? Jesus. Especially if you're Chinese or Russian and you know, if you're Xi or you're Putin, and you know very well that the man you're talking to is essentially an actor. I mean, they say that, you know, Obama's an actor, Trump's an actor, Reagan was actually an actor. The actual power lies in, well, partially in Wall Street, but within the interconnected systems of Wall Street and the various different bureaucracies of Washington, Federal Reserve and other places where power actually lies in the US system. Yeah, imagine talking to the actor who thinks he's actually in charge of something. Yes, imagine having to have a conversation with Ursula von der Leyen. Dreadfink. Putin's shirt says, in 2016, Putin gifted a bust of Hugo Chavez to Maduro and was awarded the first Hugo Chavez Peace Prize. In November 2022, Putin made a pretty speech about Castro while unveiling the monument. Yeah, he admires Castro, obviously. I think he's quite clearly got a great appreciation for the Cuban Revolution. Good morning to all comrades, says Jeremy Turner. Do you know what Castro's attitude towards Stalin was? Favorable, and remained favorable, I think, right to the end. We had to massage that in the Soviet period, of course, but I don't think he ever denounced Stalin as the Soviet leadership did in the Khrushchev and Gorbachev periods. Putin's shirt says, Chinese banks stopped taking payments from Russian businesses in early March, presumably threatened with sanctions. Does anyone know any more about this? I would say that what happened is some Chinese banks had stopped taking some payments from the Russians, but I think that they already had ones. It's like the partnership between the Chinese and the Russians is so important that if they wouldn't let the threats from the US get in the way of their doing business together. So if they publicly stated that they were stopping taking payments, my guess is that the Chinese and the Russians had already found new ways to pay payments that didn't involve those particular banks, because it's potentially the case that some of these banks had operations that could have been threatened with sanctions. So my guess is they moved the payments elsewhere and then said, "Oh, we're not taking them anymore." I think would it be emphasized West? Oh, it's a great victory for us, but whatever happened there, there'd already been alternative arrangements made. Same with the games that Erdogan plays over the Mir card and stuff like that. He'll make a public announcement one day saying, "Well, we're not taking it in Turkey anymore," and then it'll turn out that they are. Like all that the West gets now, all the US gets now, is when they do make threats which have some teeth to them, all they get is placated, and then the Chinese banks will still be doing business with the Russians anyway. They've just made this big announcement. Again, alternative means of making payments and receipts already have been put in place, I'm sure. Don't forget about the DPRK. Well, DPRK's importance is recognized by the Russians because, of course, there's the question of the Russian presence in the DPRK, which has grown. The Russian embassy there has grown, and we keep getting these stories about the DPRK supplying shells to Russia. It's always seen as like, oh, look at the Russians are being supplied by the DPRK, but as if the Russians are losers because of that. But the DPRK's got a very advanced military industry and has had for years. They've had to face off against the US imperialists in the south. So the benefits for the DPRK of increased trade with Russia will be notable. We'll have to see how that goes. And we get a comment from Kobe who says, the Chinese did supersede the USSR in the political system. Also, there's a reason why Mao is the fifth head. We will be coming to this in future programs. Mao is the fifth head because Mao is the one who develops further the ideas and practices of the struggle, the class struggle inside the socialist state, the class struggle after the revolution, the class struggle to effectively implement the dictatorship of the proletariat. All of that is developed by Lenin, developed further by Stalin, but much, much further by Mao in a legacy that's not properly appreciated. But we will be having an appreciation of that on this channel very soon. Okay, I have to call things to a close there for today. I didn't get through everything I needed to, but it's been an interesting discussion anyway. So I'll be back again tomorrow, and we'll do more on the multipolarity question, more on the question of the wars in both Ukraine and occupied Palestine. But until then, thank you to everybody who has tuned in, and I will be back with you again tomorrow.